the only other thing I was just going to touch on was the mask requirement that was enacted by the city council last night. Just to kind of clarify things, the only time that there's going to be a police response is basically if there's some type of other issue. So if somebody is not wearing a mask and people call police, there's not going to be any police response. There will be a police response if there's some type of dispute or disturbance, like a disorderly conduct type of call or an assault call. Obviously, we'll go in cases like that. The other cases would involve businesses. So either if a business has a specific policy about a mask and somebody's not following that, and that person won't comply and they wouldn't leave the business or the establishment, the owner or manager could call police, and then we could remove that person for failure to vacate. The other instance would be closely tied to that, but if the owner or manager decides they don't want that person anymore to come to their business anymore, and then they want a trespass notice that prohibits that person from coming back on that property, then they'd call police and then we would respond to that. But by and large, most of these problems, if somebody sees an issue, if somebody's not wearing a mask and they call police, there's not going to be a response unless there's some other problems or some other issues surrounding that. So just kind of wanted to touch on that. But
that'd be more of like a secondary offense, like in addition to something else.
Yeah, all those instances, we've either got like a disorderly conduct, an assault, trespassing, failure to vacate. Those are all crimes that we have in state law and city ordinance. So there's some type of enforcement that would take place with that. If somebody's just not wearing their mask, we're not going to respond in cases.
And so, like, if a business has, like you said, was not wanting to wear a mask, then they can call police and have it enforced.
Well, we're not going to enforce anything about, that's going to be right, that would be the store's policy, that if the store has a policy that people have to wear a mask and somebody's not wearing a mask or refuses to wear a mask, that business has the right to refuse service and tell that person that they need to leave the property. If they don't leave, then we have a failure to vacate crime that has taken place. And so in those instances, the officers would show up, explain the law to the people and say, you know, they've requested that you leave, you have to leave, otherwise you could be arrested and charged with a crime. And I'd say probably 95% of those times, those cases when that happens, obviously not over a mask, but we've seen that in the past, most people are compliant, and when the police show up, they leave, and so there's no problems or issues after that. But if that's the problem, the root problem is because of the mask, because somebody doesn't want to wear the mask, that business still has the right to ask them to leave and refuse service. And so those are times when police would get involved.
Have you guys ever had a kind of a ordinance or something like this before?
Not that I can recall. I'm certainly there's a lot of ordinances that, but I think as far as I can recall, I think all of them have had some type of penalty. I don't recall any ordinances that haven't had any penalty associated with it. So, I mean, we've had some in the past that have been civil penalties. Most of them are some type of criminal penalty, but obviously it depends on the nature of what we're talking about.
So if somebody was like cited for not wearing a mask, is there like a fine or penalty at all?
There would not be any type of citation for not wearing a mask. There's no enforcement behind that. So if somebody's not wearing a mask, there's nothing that police can do to make somebody wear a mask or not wear a mask. What we're talking about is other problems that would be stemming. So that, I mean, that would be the root issue, is somebody not wearing a mask inside a business. And if the business has a policy, that's still a dispute type of thing between the business and that customer, but the business can have that person leave or request that they leave. And if they don't leave, then that would become a criminal matter. That would be the failure to vacate or trespassing.
I think I know the answer to this, but could a business, is there any sort of punishment for a business that isn't doing any sort of enforcement on it at all?
No, there's nothing, there's no penalty for not complying with this ordinance. So, I mean, we're not going to have, the only type of involvement police are going to have is if there's some other laws that are violated. Obviously, the mask ordinance or the mask requirement, that's going to be probably the root issue, but there's other laws that could be violated from that. And I could equate this to like texting. People are texting on their phone. There's some specific, I don't want to say that. There's some things that need to happen before police can take enforcement on that. But if you have somebody that's on their phone and the light turns green and they're not driving, there are other laws that could come into play. So if somebody's swerving in their lane and they're on their phone and the officer doesn't have enough to be able to determine that they met that texting ordinance, they'd be cited for lane usage or careless driving, or, I mean, there's a number of different things that would, the root cause in that instance would be somebody on their phone, but there's other laws that would apply to that. So I would kind of equate it to that. In those instances, obviously, there's a penalty with being on your phone while driving. The mask ordinance is a little bit different. The mask requirement ordinance is a little bit different because we don't have a penalty associated with that. So there may be some problems, there may not. We're hoping that even if somebody's at a business and the owner or manager tells them, you have to have a mask, it's our policy. If the people refuse and they say, well, you need to leave, if somebody leaves, then there's no issue. There's no problems. There's no reason for police to be involved. If the person stays there after being told to leave, that's when the police would get involved and show up and explain the law to them, and hopefully it'd end after that they would just leave.